The Secret of Blackwood Manor. Chapter 1. The New Beginning. Thomas was a young writer. He lived in a big, noisy city, but he did not like it. The city was always loud. Cars made noise all day and night. People were always in a hurry. Thomas wanted a quiet place to write his new book. He wanted a place with trees, birds, and silence. One day, he saw an advertisement in a newspaper. It said, "Beautiful old house in the countryside for rent. Very cheap. Perfect for writers and artists." The house was called Blackwood Manor. Thomas smiled. "This is exactly what I need," he said to himself. The next day, he packed his bags, took his old typewriter, and caught a train to a small village called Oak Ridge. When the train stopped, Thomas stepped outside. The air was fresh and clean. The village was very small. There were only a few shops, a small bakery, and an old pub. Thomas walked to the pub to ask for directions. Inside, an old man with grey hair was cleaning glasses. His name was Arthur. "Excuse me," Thomas said politely. "Can you tell me how to get to Blackwood Manor?" Arthur stopped cleaning the glass. He looked at Thomas with wide eyes. The pub became very quiet. "Blackwood Manor?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "Why do you want to go there, young man?" "I rented it," Thomas replied. "I am a writer. I need silence." Arthur shook his head slowly. "Silence is not the only thing you will find there. That house has been empty for 20 years. The villagers do not go near it. Strange things happen in that place." Thomas laughed gently. He did not believe in ghost stories. "I am sure it is just an old house that needs some cleaning. Don't worry." Arthur sighed and pointed out the window. "Follow the dirt road through the forest for 2 miles. When the trees become dark and thick, you will see the iron gates. But remember, young writer, if you hear a sound at night, do not look for it." Thomas thanked the old man and started his walk. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. Chapter 2. The Iron Gates. The walk through the forest was beautiful, but lonely. As Thomas walked deeper, the trees grew taller and closer together. The sunlight disappeared, and long shadows stretched across the road. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves under his boots. Finally, he saw it. Large, rusty iron gates stood between 2 old stone pillars. Behind the gates, sitting on a small hill, was Blackwood Manor. It was a magnificent 3-story house made of dark stone. Ivy covered the walls, and the windows looked like dark eyes watching the forest. It looked lonely, but beautiful in a mysterious way. Thomas pushed the heavy gates. They opened with a loud, piercing creak that echoed through the quiet forest. He walked up the stone path to the front door. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a heavy iron flower pot. He opened the door and stepped inside. The air inside was cold and smelled of dust and old paper. Thomas turned on his flashlight. The entrance hall was grand. A large wooden staircase led to the 2nd floor. A thick layer of dust covered everything. The old paintings on the walls, the long velvet curtains, and the elegant furniture. Thomas found the living room. It had a large fireplace and a comfortable leather armchair. "It needs some work, but it is perfect," Thomas whispered. He spent the next 2 hours cleaning the living room and a small bedroom upstairs. He built a warm fire in the fireplace. The crackling of the wood made the house feel cozy. He sat in the armchair, made a cup of hot tea, and opened his notebook. For the first time in months, his mind felt free. He wrote for hours, lost in his words. At midnight, Thomas decided to sleep. He walked upstairs to his bedroom, climbed into bed, and closed his eyes. The house was completely silent. Then, at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, he heard it. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of footsteps. But they were not on his floor. They were coming from directly above his head, from the third floor. The floor that was supposed to be completely locked and empty. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. Thomas sat up in bed. His heart was beating fast. He listened carefully. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps moved slowly across the ceiling, then stopped. Thomas remembered old Arthur's words from the pub. "If you hear a sound at night, do not look for it." "It is just an old house," Thomas whispered to himself, trying to stay calm. "It is just the wind, or maybe a wild animal like a raccoon." He covered his head with his blanket and tried to sleep. After an hour, the sound did not return, and he finally fell asleep. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly through the window. The terrifying feelings of the night disappeared. Thomas felt brave again. He ate a simple breakfast and decided to explore the third floor during the daytime. He climbed the dark stairs to the top floor. The air here was even colder. There was only one long hallway with 3 doors. The first 2 doors were open. Inside were just empty rooms with old carpets. But the third door at the end of the hallway was different. It was made of heavy dark wood and had a large, shiny brass lock. Unlike the rest of the house, this lock had no dust on it. Someone had cleaned it recently. Thomas tried to turn the doorknob, but it was locked tight. He looked through the keyhole, but it was completely dark inside. "Strange," Thomas murmured. He looked around the floor for a key, but found nothing. He decided to go back to the village to buy some food and ask Arthur about the history of the house. He needed answers. Chapter 4. The Story of the Alchemist. When Thomas entered the village pub, Arthur smiled warmly. "You are alive," the old man joked, but his eyes were serious. "How was your first night?" Thomas sat at the counter. "The house is beautiful, Arthur, but I heard something. Footsteps on the third floor. And there is a locked room at the end of the hallway. The lock is perfectly clean. Who lived there before?" Arthur's smile vanished. He leaned closer to Thomas. 20 years ago, the house belonged to a man named Charles Blackwood," Arthur began. "He was not a normal man. He was an alchemist and a scientist. He did not talk to the villagers. He spent all his time in that room on the third floor. People said he was looking for something special. A secret book or an object that could change a person's life." "What happened to him?" Thomas asked, fascinated. "One night, a terrible storm came. Arthur said, looking out the window. The sky was full of lightning. The villagers saw a bright blue light coming from the windows of the third floor. The next day, the house was silent. When the police came, the front door was open. Charles Blackwood was gone. They searched the entire house, but they never found him. And they could never open that door on the third floor. The key was missing. Did they look everywhere? Thomas asked. Everywhere, Arthur nodded. But some secrets want to stay hidden, Thomas. My advice? Pack your bags and leave. Thomas thanked Arthur, but he could not leave. He was a writer, and this was the most interesting story he had ever heard. He had to know what was behind that door. Chapter 5. The Hidden Key. Thomas returned to Blackwood Manor late in the afternoon. He did not write that evening. Instead, he searched the house for the key to the third floor room. He looked under the carpets, inside the old clocks, behind the paintings, and inside every drawer in the kitchen. He found old letters, photographs of people he did not know, and old coins, but no key. The sun went down, and the house became dark again. Thomas sat in the living room by the fire. He was tired. He looked at the large wooden bookshelf against the wall. It was filled with hundreds of old books about history, science, and poetry. If I were a scientist who loved secrets, where would I hide a key? Thomas thought. He stood up and walked to the bookshelf. He began to examine the books one by one. After an hour, he noticed something strange about a heavy leather book titled The Gateway to the Mind. It was stuck. He could not pull it out. Thomas pushed the book instead. Click. A loud sound came from inside the wall. The entire bookshelf slowly moved forward, revealing a small, hidden compartment behind it. Inside the compartment sat a small wooden box. Thomas opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, lying on a piece of black velvet, was a heavy brass key. It was perfectly clean and shining in the firelight. At that exact moment, the clock on the wall struck midnight. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps started again on the third floor. But this time, they were faster. They were moving toward the staircase. Chapter 6. The Face in the Dark. Thomas froze. The footsteps were coming down the stairs from the third floor to the second floor. He held the brass key tightly in his hand. Fear told him to run out of the house into the forest. But curiosity was stronger. He picked up his flashlight, stepped out of the living room, and walked to the bottom of the grand staircase. He shone the flashlight up the stairs. The wooden steps were empty, but he could distinctly hear the sound of boots stepping on the wood. Creak, creak, creak. The sound stopped at the top of the stairs. Thomas held his breath. He saw a shadow move on the wall upstairs. It was the shape of a man wearing a long coat. "Who is there?" Thomas shouted, his voice shaking. No one answered. The shadow disappeared. Thomas knew this was his only chance. He ran up the stairs, passing the second floor, and climbed all the way to the third floor. The hallway was freezing cold. His breath made white clouds in the air. He ran to the end of the hallway, straight to the locked door. He put the brass key into the clean lock. It fit perfectly. He turned the key. Clack! The heavy lock opened. Thomas pushed the door and stepped inside, shutting the door quickly behind him. Chapter 7. The Alchemist's Room. Thomas turned on his flashlight and looked around. The room was not scary. It was beautiful. It was a large laboratory and library. The walls were covered with shelves full of glass bottles containing colorful liquids, old maps of the stars, and strange silver instruments. In the center of the room was a large oak desk. On the desk sat an open book, a fountain pen, and a beautiful, glowing blue crystal. The crystal was sitting on a silver plate, emitting a soft, warm light that illuminated the room. Thomas walked slowly to the desk. He looked at the open book. It was a diary. The handwriting was elegant. He read the last page. October 14th, 2006. I have finally done it. The crystal works. It is not a tool for making gold. It is a key to another place. A place of pure knowledge and peace. Tonight, during the storm, I will open the doorway. If anyone finds this room in the future, do not be afraid. My footsteps are just an echo in time. The crystal keeps the door open. It was signed, Charles Blackwood. Thomas touched the pages of the diary. Suddenly, the footsteps returned, but they were inside the room now. He turned around quickly. Near the window, a faint, glowing figure of a man appeared. It was Charles Blackwood. He looked at Thomas and smiled kindly. He did not look like a monster or a scary ghost. He looked like a peaceful teacher. He pointed to the typewriter on the desk, then slowly faded away into the air. The room became quiet. The cold air disappeared, replaced by a comfortable warmth. Chapter 8. The Echo of Time. Thomas realized the truth. The house was not haunted by an evil spirit. The alchemist's experiment had created an echo, a loop in time that connected the past to the present. The footsteps Thomas heard were just Charles Blackwood walking in his laboratory 20 years ago. Thomas sat in the alchemist's chair. He looked at the glowing blue crystal, then at his notebook. He felt an incredible wave of inspiration. The energy in the room was full of creativity and ancient secrets. He pulled the old typewriter on the desk toward him. He put a clean piece of paper inside. He smiled, looked out the window at the quiet starry night, and began to type. Clack, clack, clack. Thomas stayed at Blackwood Manor for the rest of the year. He never heard the scary footsteps again. Instead, every night at midnight, the blue crystal glowed softly, and Thomas wrote his book. When the book was finished, he titled it The Secret of Blackwood Manor. It became a bestseller all around the world. People asked him how he wrote such a fantastic story. Thomas always smiled and said, I had a little help from an old friend who lives in the countryside. And from that day on, the old house was never lonely again.